Welcome to day 11 of our Reset Diary. Now, I know we had our Passover celebration on Saturday, and today, if you're receiving this, will be what's, of course, most commonly known as Easter Sunday. And so this would really be day 12, but we skipped a day. So just to keep everything together, we're in day 11. We have about one more week left in our diary. But today we're looking at Psalm 83. And it's a good day to look at Psalm 83 because Psalm 83 is where someone is calling upon God to destroy enemies. Not just any enemies, but enemies of God and enemies of God's people. Now, in this particular psalm, as you read it, you'll see some things that you're not quite sure that you would want to say or pray in terms of things. But you see, as we've made this switch, as God has reset us from dependence on the world system to moving with Him and His kingdom, it means there are going to be great enemies. Enemies not of us, but of the Lord, and of us because we follow the Lord. You know, Jesus said you can't serve two masters. You'll love the one or hate the other. You can't serve God and mammon. And very clearly in that statement, Jesus is distinguishing the difference between the two. There's a love-hate relationship. There is to love the one is to be an enemy of the other, and vice versa. So while we were aligned and depending on the world system, even though we might have considered ourselves aligned with God, we were aligned with a system that's an enemy of God. In a sense, we were an enemy of God. But now that we've aligned ourselves and with God and His kingdom so that we're listening to Him and moving with Him, then because we're aligned with Him, we're now enemies of the world system. Now, let me just say a couple of things as you read through this psalm about the enemies. It speaks there especially about enemies' desires to wipe out the people of God. And here he specifically is referring to Israel. During our Passover gathering, Rick Weineke spoke eloquently, as he always does, and very deeply about blessing Israel. Blessing Israel is a very key component of the kingdom of God, because here's the reality, and this is what Satan, the enemy of enemies of God, is how he thinks about Israel. Because you see, the enemy understands if he can eliminate Israel, he can virtually eliminate God, because Israel is God's inheritance in the earth. If you wipe out the inheritance, then you've wiped out everything as far as God is concerned. And God had said this about Israel. He says, "Behold, I've engraved you on the palm of my hand." So you see, if the enemy understands, if he can come against the Jewish people and destroy them as a people, then in a sense he cut off the hand of God, which is a very symbol of God's power and might. So when we're calling upon God to deal with His enemies, we're calling upon Him not to deal with necessarily in terms of our personal enemies, although the more we walk with God, the more we're going to see enemies rise up against us. We're talking about God rising up against enemies of His people, of which we are one, God coming against enemies of the Jewish people. See, this is why the Holocaust was such a terrible event. It was Satan's attempt to wipe out God's inheritance in the earth. Now, if the enemy is successful in wiping out Jews, it means he will also be wiping out all those who who know Jesus. I don't know that many Christians realize this. You can distinguish between Israel and the nation of Israel and the church. That's usually how people want to try to think about it, that the church replaces Israel or some other kind of theological thinking. But here's the reality. Those Jewish people who have believed in the Lord himself, in God, and listen with him, they are the covenant people, the one to whom God gave the promises. And it's because God grafts us and connects us and adopts us as sons that we become a part of that covenant people. We're not naturally born as Jews are, as a part of the covenant, but we are legally brought in as sons. So we have to see here, if when the world system comes against Jews, then it comes against anyone who is authentically a son or daughter of the Most High God. That's why it's important for us to bless Israel. Because when we bless Israel, we bless his inheritance. And for those of us who share in that inheritance, we, in a sense, release blessing upon ourselves and those around us. So it's very important that we understand the role of Israel in God's whole plan, in his covenant, so that we find ourselves on his side in this, not on the side of the world system. Now, as this psalm will show you, there are a variety of different kinds of enemies that always want to take God's inheritance. And so it's important and his inheritance is Israel. He says it in Isaiah. He said that Egypt is my people, Syria is my handiwork, but Israel is my inheritance. Okay? Israel is the first portion of the earth that belongs to God. We're a part of that first portion by adoption. And the whole earth, which is the Lord's, is our inheritance along with Jesus. So you see, we've got a very big stake in this. Now, as we face the world system, we're going to come against the enemies of God, and there are plenty of them. And there are strategies that they share against the people of God. Now, today there's a lot of confusion about that. As I read in the paper today, there's some people who think that the fact that their government has said they can't have Easter services, they regard it as some kind of plot against God. I don't consider that the case at all, necessarily, especially in this particular case. However, what it does mean is that we have got to know who God's enemies are and not assume that we know. So in this hour, in this kind of time, as we're realigning and God is realigning us in his covenant, we have got to see things as he sees it. That means that we have to ask the Lord himself and hear from him. Who are his enemies and who are not? Because if we don't, we'll align against people who are not his enemies. And we will align with his enemies against God and his people and even our own selves. That's just the way it works. So this is a time I want to encourage you to listen. Listen to the Lord and ask him, when you see things happening that don't look right, ask him, say, now, Lord, is this your enemy? This looks like it opposes you, Lord. Is this what you're opposed to? Don't assume this. Make sure that you clarify it with the Lord, because he'll be glad to tell you. And when he does, then you call on him to deal with his enemies. You see, part of living in the covenant of blessing with God is that God says he'll deal with our enemies. Because when we're aligned with him, his enemies become our enemies. Just as when we align with him and listen to him, his thoughts become our thoughts and his ways become our ways, so his enemies become our enemies. Now, maybe you didn't know you were getting all that when you made the switch, but you've got it now. And so now's the time, because God will deal with these enemies. These are enemies that come against the earth. They are world system. They are greed structure. They are financial structures, political structures, structures of injustice and domination, structures of fear, structures that act like they know God when Jesus says, I know them not. So this is a time for us to really begin to become a discerning people, not because we figured it out, but because we've asked the Lord and He's told us, these are my enemies. And then He wants us to call on Him to do to them what the psalmist in Psalm 83 is calling upon God to do to their enemies. Yes, we're entering into a new era. Now, I want to mention a couple of things from our Passover get-together. We had almost 800 people. We had 1,300 people who pre-registered, and we had 800 people who actually were online with us from all over the world. And at least 29 countries were included in those who registered. Now, this was our first time to do something like this. It won't be our last time, Lord willing, because this is something that God wants to do with us. He wants to move with us as we walk through this year. I don't know how long these kinds of gatherings will have them or they'll go on, but I know that there'll be more. And so I'm grateful that you were willing to, those of you who joined us were able to, and we have a few issues that we'll clear up for the next time we meet in that kind of platform. For those who signed up but couldn't be a part of it, we're going to send everyone who registered a follow-up letter or two and send you some links so that you can actually participate in it. And I really think that even when you registered, you were a part of it. So everything that took place during that meeting, everything that God released or is doing, you're still a part of that in a very significant way. I also want to point you to a link that I'll send you in relationship to this particular psalm. And it's a link, and I'll send you another video with it as well, that includes Rick Weineke and his Fountain of Tears presentation. This is so important to bless Israel. And this is no greater time than to do this. And so anyway, I'll send that link to you. You can look at the video. It was actually a time that Rick and I spent together online. And then you can connect with his online presentation of the Fountain of Tears. I think you'll see how strategic the Fountain of Tears is to unlocking blessing around the earth, since so much of the earth is involved in conflict and in injustice. You know, when Jesus rose from the dead, when he died and rose from the dead, which is what this time of the year, of course, remembers and looks at, it was a clear demonstration that the enemies of God were completely and utterly defeated. That defeat is real, which is why as we step forward, we don't have to fear our enemies. We don't have to capitulate to them. But we can step into the very victory that Jesus secured. If you read Romans 8, especially in verses 26 and following, you'll find him saying that because of Jesus, because God is for us, who can be against us? Because of Jesus, we are more than overcomers. So everything that might stand in our way, we can walk with it, walk through it, walk past it, climb over it, move it aside, because we are overcomers. Now, don't be fooled during these times, because you're going to hear a lot of different opinions about what's taking place in society. This is a time for you to ask the Lord yourself, so that you can know very clearly how he thinks and how he sees the events and things taking place in this day. So I bless you as you go through this psalm today, and may it be a next step in opening your eyes, opening your heart, opening your mind, so that you begin to see things very clearly and move decisively with him as you step into his covenant of blessing.